I'm Vice Signal, and this is Cancel Lincoln.
Massachusetts was the first English colony in America to legalize slavery in 1638. For more than 200 years, African slavery existed in Boston, along with Newport, Rhode Island, where by the mid-18th century, 1/3 of its population were slaves. In 1750, there were 3 times as many slaves in Connecticut as there were in Georgia, and 4 times as many in Massachusetts. Nearly all New England aristocrats used slaves for farm and household labor. In 1703, more than 42% of New York City households owned slaves. In fact, according to a 2005 New York Historical Society exhibition on the topic of slavery in New York, quote, "For portions of the 17th and 18th centuries, New York City housed the largest urban slave population in mainland North America, with more slaves than any other city on the continent. During those years, slaves composed more than a quarter of the labor force in the city, and perhaps as much as half of the workers in many of its outlying districts. Slaves could be found in New York into the 5th decade of the 19th century." Close quote. This is not surprising, given the immense wealth generated by the flesh-peddling market. New England was center of the American slave trade during the colonial era. It was also where the ships that transported most of the slaves from Africa to the Western Hemisphere were built. In fact, all the U.S. slave ships ever made were built by the North, and mostly by slave labor. No slave ships were ever built by the South. They were used in the New England Triangle trade, a route of the transatlantic slave trade. According to Dr. Samuel Mitchum Jr., author of It Wasn't About Slavery, Exposing the Great Lie of the Civil War, quote, "Yankee sailors loaded their slave ships in a New England port with fish and rum. They then sailed to Africa, where they exchanged the rum for slaves. Next, they sailed to the West Indies, where they traded the slaves for gold and molasses. After this, they returned to New England, where they sold the molasses to distillers so that they could make more rum." Close quote. This international bartering of human beings for gold and goods indicates the degree to which flesh peddling was a staple of the Yankee economy. And while the slave trade was outlawed by Congress in 1808, signed into law by President Thomas Jefferson, it still went on illegally for almost another century. For example, Manhattan shipyards continued to build slave ships that were used to transport slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and elsewhere even after the Civil War ended in 1865. According to the famous black scholar and Harvard professor W.E.B. Du Bois, citing the New York Journal of Commerce, New York City was the largest slave trading port in the world in January 1862, followed by Portland, Maine, and Boston, Massachusetts, all Yankee states. The 85 slave ships sailing out of New York City transported 30,000 to 60,000 slaves from Africa to the Western Hemisphere yearly. And following the illegalization of slavery in the New England region, New York City bankers continued to profit from the enterprise by loaning money for the purchase of new slaves and accepting slaves as collateral. Moreover, several decades after the Civil War, Connecticut businessmen operated an ivory trade that enslaved as many as 2 million people in Africa, which was emblematic of the New England elitist hypocrisy. Lincoln alluded to this hypocrisy during a peace negotiation with Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens in February 1865 that perhaps slave owners should be compensated for their lost property after the war, saying, quote, "If it was wrong in the South to hold slaves, it was wrong in the North to carry on the slave trade and sell them to the South." Close quote. Another example of Northern hypocrisy was when President John Quincy Adams, who was from New England, forbade British inspectors from searching American ships for smuggled slaves, following the British Empire's ban of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. As a result, the U.S. flag protected New England slave traders from arrest and criminal prosecution all the way up until 1885, 20 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished it. The great irony here is the fact that Virginia, Confederate head General Robert E. Lee's home state, and where the capital of the Confederacy was located, abolished the slave trade in 1778, 30 years before the U.S. Congress, and unlike their Yankee counterparts, with no unofficial government complicity in the black market following the ban. But just as it was self-interest that caused New Englanders to tacitly continue supporting the slave trade even after the Civil War, it was also self-interest that caused them to abolish it at home, and not enlightened benevolence, as we are told by Yankee lore.
Thank you for watching that episode of Cancel Lincoln. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel while you're at it. It really goes a long way in spreading the content. Thank you again, fellow rabble-rousers.